I was around 8 or 9 when this happened. I went to visit my grandparents on the other side of town. They lived 5 minutes away from an elementary school, and I would often walk to it to play on the playground. A young family with a daughter my age lived right next door, and we would play together whenever I came over. Well, one day we decided to take a walk after having some fun at the park. We still had a lot of energy and dinner wasn't quite ready yet, so we wandered throughout the neighborhood. We were laughing and picking flowers along the way when I noticed a white van. We continued our walk, and before you know it, I had completely forgotten all about it. My friend had stopped to tie her shoe, and I was looking around for more flowers to pick when I realized that we had gone a lot further than we ever had before. I didn't recognize the houses in front of me, and it was going to get dark very soon. As soon as that thought entered my mind, I see the white van rounding the corner, heading straight towards us. My stomach sank. It was the same van from earlier, but something seemed different. They stopped in the middle of the road and stared at us. I told my friend that we needed to go, and I asked her if she recognized the houses around us or the van in front of us. Of course, she didn't for either. I tell her that we should probably head home, and she agrees. The van then drives past us slowly, and the man in the passenger seat rolls down the window. Excuse me, do you girls know where, Apple Street is? We both say no, and I get a good look at the van. It has a picture of a vacuum on the side, and a company name I can't remember. He tells us that they're cleaning houses in the neighborhood, and they can't seem to find the street they're looking for. I know I'm not supposed to talk to strangers, so I grab my friend's hand and tell the men sorry, but no, we don't, and we keep walking. We begin our walk home, but my uneasy feeling goes stronger every step of the way. We were going back the same way we'd came, when I started to recognize the houses. We were only about 10 minutes away at this point. Then I hear it, the van coming down the street behind us. I told my friend to grab a rock from the path, because now I was sure they were following us. I was scared, but I knew we were not too far from my grandparents' house, and we could get there faster if we ran. So that's what we do. Picture 2 terrified 8-year-old girls running down the street with softball-sized rocks in their hands. I look back and see the van racing after us. I can hear someone yelling. It's the man driving, and I hear the word directions. I stop because I'm out of breath, and I think maybe that's all they wanted. Maybe I was just overreacting. Boy, was I wrong. As soon as I stop, my friend does too, and so does the van. I get a good look at the driver this time, and he's explaining that all they wanted was directions. But I knew that something was wrong, and before I could even get any words out, the sliding door blew open, and a man in the back started rushing towards us. We pelted the rocks at him and ran as fast as we could to my grandparents' house. When we got inside, we started crying our eyes out. My mom had apparently arrived while we were gone. I run to her and my grandma and told them what just happened. She runs outside yelling to my grandma to call the cops while she looks for the van. She sees it parked 2 houses down, and she charges it like a bull. I had run out after her, so I'm standing there screaming. My mom is tiny, but she is fierce, and was in mama bear mode. The van started to pull away, but I'll never forget what happened next. She jumped onto the hood of the van and started beating in their window. They stop, and she yells that she's making a citizen's arrest, and they need to stop the car now. They act like they're going to. They slowly pull over and park, but as soon as she gets off the hood, they race off. Thank God she managed to remember their entire license plate. When the police get there, they ask us so many questions. I try to explain everything that happened from the moment I first saw the van. They run the license plate number, and it comes back as out of state. They say I can go now, and they want to speak to my mom alone. When she comes back inside, I hear her talking to my grandma in the kitchen. What she said makes my blood run cold to this day. The man who owned the car was linked to a kidnapping out of state and had a bolo out for his arrest. The police ended up arresting all 3 men, and we had to go in to give an official statement. My friend, my mom, and I picked all three of them out of the lineup, and they were charged with kidnapping out of state and our attempted kidnapping. I never went walking in my grandparents' neighborhood after that, and I still cringe when I see a white van. That's when I realized there's a reason for all those creepy white van stories after all. In the fall of 2015, I began college in a very small town in the middle of nowhere. Its population as of 2019 is 55,489. This town was right in the middle of the Midwestern state I lived in the middle of the Great Plains. The town was pretty much only existent because of the college. It was a state college, which has about 20,000 students a year. As you could imagine, the college brought in a plethora of faculty, business, and really put the town on the map. I personally stuck out like a sore thumb. You see, even though I lived in the Bible Belt, I had been Wiccan since I was 15. I never identified with Jesus and God when I grew old enough to dissect the Christian faith. A big aspect about my personality is that I am very accepting. I mention this because it ultimately led to some chaos later on. I'm the class clown mom friend type. I'm sure you know the type. Goofy and caring, pretty much ride or die. So, I was in the middle of nowhere at the beginning of my college career, and I was surrounded by strangers who were just as nervous and awkward as I was. Due to being in the middle of the Bible Belt, my friends really loved my tarot card, medium, future-seeing persona. And quickly, whilst making new friends, I ran into a few folks who wanted to learn how to read tarot. We lived in the same dorm community. They were nice, and I loved teaching. So that's how I ended up getting into cahoots with Alex, Davis, April, Sam, Rosie, Katie, and Sky. They were friends from the year prior, so I was sort of folded into the friend group as the newest, shiniest object. After mentioning that I read tarot, the group was over the moon. One afternoon, in the basement of our dormitory, I had a tarot reading session for the group. It was a lazy fall day, mid-November, surrounded by soda cans, Kit Kats, and our leftover schoolwork. I began to read each and every group member's cards. With reading, you start to peek into a person's soul. Each card gives you a sliver of personhood. I quite regularly have to console people for the truth that lies within the reading. I've often had to play the role of therapist after the cards read people for filth, so it was unsurprising to me when the group sat in shocking curiosity, goosebumps prickling their arms. It was a normal response. Hours flew by. I did general readings, question-based readings, love life readings, you name it. As time rolled on, more of my talent slipped out. Soon I was reading palms, giving psychic advice, talking about my Wiccan journey. I believe that what you take from the earth you should give back. It's inherent to my belief system to do everything with love, to never mean any ill will. Alex asked me if I could teach them about my beliefs, then Katie, then Davis. Before I knew it, everyone in the group had asked for an impromptu teaching. Don't get this wrong. I loved teaching, but more so I craved this positive attention. My childhood was quite awful, and I was very abused. I just wanted people who cared about me. These people were some of the first to really seem to care, who were really interested in what I had to say. So with rose-colored glasses, I began a fun little info sesh with my brand new friends. I didn't see the warning signs. What started out as little meetings in the study rooms turned into hour-long lectures where the group hung to every word I said. As we got closer, more of my horrific past was uncovered. I shared tales of my trauma, of all the times I should have died, the beatings, how my own mom had tried to murder me. I thought I had found my tribe. I was really excited and pleased to be around folks. I didn't start to see the warning signs until it was too late. Things went smoothly for a while, a routine of teaching the group, hanging out, having dinner, talking about normal things, like school and what was going on in the dorm communities. I really liked it, actually. One of the group members, Davis, was transitioning female to male, and he struggled a lot with his identity. He was raised in a pretty strict household, so his transition wasn't exactly taken very well by his family. He also struggled with BPD, which made people in the group very uncomfortable. I think mostly because they didn't understand it. Keep in mind, mental health at the time wasn't really something people were open about, as it was right in the middle of the Bible Belt. So Davis would occasionally act erratic, start fights, get worked up, cry randomly. I'm sure part of this was due to transitioning. I can't imagine how emotional and hard it would be to go through that. What really set things off, though, was when Davis started doubting if he should fully transition or not. Davis had already been on testosterone for quite some time, was male-presenting, but didn't have top surgery yet. One day, right before spring break, Davis had worn a dress, makeup, and heels around campus. At the time, I thought it was kind of strange, but I figured it was Davis's life, so it didn't really matter to me. The rest of the group, however, started to obsess over this. It was very out of character, but the group thought there was more to it. When Davis left for class, adorned in his dress and heels, Alex began to speculate. There was a long, weird history between Alex, Davis, and Sky. One where Davis was sort of relationship-like flirting with both Alex and Sky, creating some animosity. Alex and Sky were best friends, but Davis had sort of wriggled his way into both of their hearts. Alex wasn't one to really discuss their feelings, so they pretended this love triangle didn't affect them. But Alex had become bitter. After Davis walked out, Sky in tow, Alex began their speculation. What's wrong with him? Why is he acting like that? It's like I hardly know him. Katie, one for gossip, joined right in. Honestly, it's like Davis is a completely different person. I don't know who this is, but I hate him. He's taking advantage of Sky. The rest of the conversation began to snowball. It was a frustrating situation for those who had been in the friend group for a long time. I was pretty much indifferent. I didn't exactly know what was going on, and honestly, I thought they were kind of making a fuss out of nothing. If you're uncomfortable with what's happening, then just talk it out. I digress. I had been working on a term paper, not really minding too much about the conversation, until suddenly April asked me, "Hey, do you think you could be messing around with some bad magic?" I shrugged. Davis had asked about love spells and other things that I don't really mess with. He was really into the idea that he could just put a spell on someone and make them fall in love with him. I had told him that taking away free will is something you should never mess with. The universe doesn't take kindly to those who harm, obstruct, or take free will away from someone. April had been there when Davis asked. When Alex looked questioningly at her, April spilled the beans. Something in Alex's face contorted, as if you could see their heartbreak turn into pure rage. Alex excused themselves, and that was that. I remember being a little distressed about the situation. I really hated conflict back then. I was spending spring break at Rosie's house. Her and Sam lived in the same town. Alex and Katie would be there too. When I agreed to spend the break with them, it was before drama had started, but by the time we got to spring break, it was already too late to change anything. I spent the whole break listening to this conspiracy grow. The four of them had begun to elaborate on this black magic idea. Rosie brought up the thought that maybe Davis was possessed. I told them that I didn't think this was likely. I had a feeling things were about to go awry. The mood just felt weird. I had never been in the presence of a group of people who just accused another of being possessed. When I shot down this idea, they mentioned the time Davis growled the week prior. We were playing a game online when Davis growled a response, and I had jokingly said he sounded like a demon. I still told them it was nothing, but they would not let up. Realizing I was in a bit of trouble, I came up with a quick solution. I told them we could do some protection spells so if anything would go awry, it would be okay. That seemed to appease them well enough, or so I thought. Luckily, they left the topic alone until we were heading back to campus. "We need to do an exorcism on Davis," Rosie said, a wild look in her eyes. Rosie had dabbled in paganism before she'd met me, so she already had a solid set of beliefs and theories. The issue here, however, was that Rosie and Sam thought they could use their paganism as a tool to control those around them. I tried to correct this thought process, as it was against my belief system, which they seemed to be receptive to, at least until they felt threatened. Davis had sent a text message to Rosie about some drama with Alex and Sky, sending Rosie into a downward spiral. Before I knew it, the narrative had suddenly shifted into Davis is possessed by the demon Lilith. I didn't know what to do. I told them he wasn't. It just didn't make sense. But I was too late. I didn't know. I figured that if I got back to campus, took some time away from them, everyone would calm down. So that's exactly what I did. I tried to do as much damage control as I could on the rest of the ride, but then when I got back to the dorm, I locked myself away. When asked, I just said I was behind on work from spring break. Things were relatively quiet, and I felt safe. I figured it was temporary insanity or something. I was sat downstairs talking to April a few days after I had locked myself away. We were just chit-chatting about what she had done over the break, when I saw Rosie and Katie suddenly rush past the sitting room. They were frantic. They waved at us when they ran past but didn't say anything. A bit later, Sky ran in the same direction, crying. When he saw us, he rushed in. Davis said he's a demon and needed to be exorcised. I jumped to my feet and started running towards his dorm room. Sam and Alex stood in the hallway. Their faces hardened when they saw me, Sky, and April walking up. "You're not allowed in there. Davis is a danger to you," Sam said. "He admitted he was possessed." "He's not possessed. Just let me in there." We bickered for a long time, until I said that if they were going to do an exorcism, they needed me in there. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. Davis was laid on the bed, tied down to the bed frame. He was crying. Rosie and Katie were inside, setting things down around the bed. Rosie held a tattered old book in her hand, and there was sage burning on a plate. Katie yelled something, but I couldn't focus. I just kept thinking all of a sudden that these people were fucking crazy. All I could see was Davis, crying their eyes out on the bed. "I'm sorry. I didn't know I was possessed. I didn't know I was going to hurt you," Davis wailed, shaking. "Shh, we're going to get the demon out. You're going to be okay." I kept saying that he wasn't possessed, but nobody would listen to me. And that's when I saw the knife. It was bronze in color, with something dark crusted on it. It sat in a bowl from the dining hall, and a mix of what looked like salt, and also blood. In shock, I looked over to Rosie, spotting a bloody gauze on her arm. It was like my world stopped. At this point, I had realized that these people were fucking crazy. I'd seen enough scary movies that I could only imagine what was going to happen. I grabbed the knife and cut through the cloth that tied Davis down, grabbed his wrist and bolted from the room. I called Davis's mom and told her to come get him. We went to my dorm until she got there, with me trying to talk some sense into him. Davis went home shortly after. Rosie, Katie, Sam, and Alex were blowing up my phone. April had come with me when I ran out with Davis. When he had gone home, she started to talk about how I needed to be careful. Because if Hillary Clinton were elected president, I was special. My mother had told me that she had to kill me, or else the government would get to me. That I was special. April knew this. Apparently she believed it too. I just nodded, telling her I needed some sleep. After she left, I immediately started filing paperwork to transfer schools. I moved 2 hours away, blocking everyone in the group's phone numbers. I couldn't believe everything that had happened, but looking back, I started to see that the signs were there all along. They would always say things like, "You're a witchy Jesus," and had blind faith in everything I said. The most memorable moment was when I told them that the sky was actually green. I was just joking around being a sarcastic asshole, but April and Alex just nodded. When I said I was joking, April defended them, saying, "Well, technically the sky just reflects the earth, so it really is green." Hindsight is 20/20. I accidentally started a cult, creating a small hellhole where everyone blindly believed everything I said and thought I was a modern-day Jesus. So, to my former cult members, let's never meet again. And also, please, get some help. This all happened a long time ago, in 1994. I was only 8 years old, and my worldview was as narrow as you'd expect any child's to be. Aside from this memory I'm about to share, that year was marked by a nail-biting series of penalty kicks that ended in a nervous Roberto Baggio, aka the savior of Italy, kicking the final shot over and above the net in a crushing defeat to Italy and his own career. For the remainder of the year, I was glued to my Game Boy, playing World Cup USA 94 and trying to recreate the game with a better ending for Baggio. Of course, the graphics were bleeding edge at the time. We had just moved from my childhood home in a bad part of town to a new home in suburbia. My dad's small business had finally started making money after 3 years of losing it, and my parents wanted to give us kids some space to stretch out and play. At the time, I only had an older sister, who was 11. I was convinced this new house was haunted, but kinda thought it was a bit cool actually. My house sat on 3 acres of land, bordered by woods, and was pretty far tucked back from the rest of the neighborhood. My parents wanted to double the house in size, and add a nice kitchen for my mom who enjoys cooking for guests. They went through the motions of getting the addition permitted, and tried to find a contractor, but didn't like anyone they met. Then an employee of my father recommended her brother, Steve, who was a young contractor, early 30s. He'd just gotten his license and was very hungry for work. It was summertime, and my sister and I didn't have school, so my parents would leave her to watch me while they were at work. Twice a week, my grandma came to pick up my sister for dance lessons. I would only be alone for 90 minutes or so, and I was good about keeping myself occupied, so nobody ever thought it was a problem. On the days that we were together, Steve began to work on the house, and aside from the occasional hello, he would come and work a little at a time. It started off well, with a solid few weeks of work, but then he started coming less and less. The times he did show up, he'd spend 10% of the time working, and the rest of the time split between dancing around with headphones in and jumping on my trampoline. Yeah, he danced a lot. I didn't really understand why an adult was dancing so much while he was supposed to be working, but that also didn't really bother me, since my sister was a dancer. But my trampoline, that thing was my pride and joy. I had to vacuum the house and rake leaves for months to save up the $240 to be able to afford that thing, and there he was wearing his heavy steel-toed boots while he jumped about haphazardly. I wasn't the type to start a conflict, so I begrudgingly let it slide. One day, though, after he spent a larger-than-average jumping session on it, I went outside to inspect and found a massive tear along the edge of the trampoline. That was that. Little high-up Sam had had enough of Steve's boots. I finally complained to my parents that he ripped my trampoline, and then it all came out. He only came for a few hours a couple of times a week, and mostly just hung out and danced and played on the trampoline while my sister and I sat in the back room. I didn't fully understand what this all meant, but I remember my parents calling him to yell at him. As they yelled, I felt a big wave of guilt wash over me. I knew it was hard work, and my favorite thing about the trampoline was that it was big enough for everyone to share it. I didn't want to be a jerk, so the next time he came over, I approached him and tried to apologize. I had practiced what I was going to say. I was going to tell him I was sorry that I told on him, but I'd worked hard to buy that trampoline with my own money. He could still use it, but only if he would take off his boots before jumping on it. As I approached him, though, he threw his hammer to the ground, pointed at me, and started screaming loudly. I don't remember what he said. I was so shocked and definitely didn't expect that reaction, so I ran away, and my sister, who had heard the yelling and saw me running back, called my parents. Later that night, my parents let us know that they'd fired Steve, and he wouldn't be coming back anymore. They were on the search for a new contractor to replace him. That week, my sister and I would hear a car pulling up, idling a bit, then pulling away. We looked out every time, and it was Steve's red truck. It didn't seem strange for some reason. Maybe he was finalizing some plans to hand over the job to the next guy. A child's mind is something else. One day, my grandma came to pick up my sister for dance, and minutes after they'd pulled away, I had my nose buried in World Cup USA '94. It was 30 seconds into my latest Italy vs. Brazil match when I heard the rhythmic crunching of leaves outside my window. They stopped suddenly. Remember, I thought my house was haunted, so in my mind it was a ghost or a skeleton or some possessed doll. I freaked out and lay frozen in my bed. Then I heard sounds on the window frame, like something clawing to get a grip on the handle and trying to open them. The crunching footsteps started again and moved to my other window, followed by the same scratching sounds. At this point, I put the Game Boy down and ran out of my room and into the living room, which connects to the foyer. As I was running, I saw a figure move across the front windows and knew it was Steve. Whew, not a possessed doll after all. He smiled at me and tapped gently on the glass. Hey Sam, can you and I just talk? I feel really bad about what I did. I stared at him for a second, not quite sure what to do, before I started to feel uneasy. Come on, just let me in for a second. I want to make this right. Something felt off. His eyes seemed off. His smile seemed off. So I replied, I'm not allowed to let you in. Sorry. Just like that. A switch flipped in his head, and he started pounding the window angrily. Don't play games. You better let me in right now. His face turned red. His eyes went wide. It almost seemed like he was drooling. Confused, I turned and ran back into my room and locked the door. Hey, if you don't open the door, I'm going to break this window. I know you're in there. I screamed that I was calling the police and telling them that he was there. A bluff. Everyone had a cordless phone in their room except for me, but I didn't know what else to do. Just like that, I heard him pound on the glass one last time before hearing his truck drive out of the driveway. Shaken, I left my room and called my mom. A few days later, she told me he would no longer be bothering me. I thought she had done her mom thing and given him a stern talking to. My mom was terrifying, a short Italian woman who spit fireballs and wasn't afraid to hit you with a wooden spoon, so that seemed the obvious conclusion. When I was 19 and home from college one night, I asked my parents whatever happened with him. They told me that according to his sister, their employee, he had fallen down a drug spiral, likely meth, and lost control. A few days after the incident at our house, he had been accused of assaulting another young boy, and the police found incriminating photos. After that, he jumped off a local bridge and ended his own life before he could be arrested. That's when it all hit me. My memory as a child was horribly skewed. He was not just trying to talk to me, and wasn't mad at me for not letting him in. Looking back as an adult, it was clear Steve had some issues he was working through. Being gay in the 90s must not have been easy, and it makes me sad to think about what kind of person he might have been if society had just accepted him. But what he did to the other boy is absolutely unacceptable, and there's no way that can be justified, no matter how he might have tried to. It might have been me that day. I was lucky to have dodged him. When I was 7, I lived in a dusty, vacant part of the West with an atmosphere straight out of a Judy Blume novel. Despite everyone in my neighborhood living on large, isolated plots of land, mostly being ranching families, kids played hockey in the streets, crime was minimal to non-existent, and everybody knew everyone else. I had a very tight-knit group of friends. Names changed to protect privacy. Let's call them Shirley, Natalie, and Bailey. We'd all been friends since before we could even walk, mostly because we were the same age and all lived in the same neighborhood. We weren't exactly idiots, but we were definitely sheltered. The same could be said of our parents, many of whom had ended their education after high school, or even a bit sooner, and grew up in a similar, if not the exact same community, where anyone who'd shake your hand was probably trustworthy. That's why no one noticed anything before it was too late. Just before the summer started, a new family moved in. Families moving in wasn't terribly uncommon, but this family had a girl my and my friend's age, so it became a very big deal. Her name was Ella, and her whole family was a bit strange. It took 2 weeks for them to introduce themselves to anyone. Plenty of people went over to introduce themselves, but even when it was obvious people were home, no one came to the door. Finally, word got around that the father was a minister at some church no one in town had heard of, and the wife was working part-time at the tailor's. We spent a lot of time outside and eventually spotted Ella. My friends and I invited her to join our group in whatever we were up to that afternoon. Through that, we learned she had 4 older brothers and an infant sister. She and her whole family had very antiquated gender roles, prayed before and about virtually anything they did, and would casually mention the end of the world as a non sequitur. Despite this, they managed to establish themselves as pillars of the community. The father, let's call him Mr. Cyrus, came to every town hall, and his wife, Miss Cyrus, took up a leadership role in the PTA. I think their wholesome Christian image helped defray what would have otherwise been deeply troubling outbursts of rage, which Mr. Cyrus would exhibit, sometimes right out in public. He'd hear another adult use a phrase like "God damn it," and fly into a frenzy about "how dare you forsake our Lord and Savior," taking his name in vain. His wife would make unsolicited, judgmental comments about how other people raise their kids, especially daughters. Despite all that, within a few months you'd never know they hadn't lived there all their lives. The unspoken understanding in this town was that if you left your kids in someone else's care, they had free rein to do whatever they thought best for them and to feed them, instruct them, or discipline them, as if they were your own. The first time I went to Ella's, nothing out of the ordinary happened. The second time, Mr. Cyrus led all of us in prayer before we ate our snack, and afterwards. I mentioned to my mom how I found it irritating, and she basically said, "Their house, their rules." I shrugged it off. Neither of us had any way to know Mr. Cyrus was just testing the waters. A few weeks later, several of our families had gotten together, and Mr. Cyrus brought a rifle out of nowhere and asked us girls if we wanted to shoot some cans. He said to the parents once he'd gotten us excited, "I mean, if you're comfortable with guns." Remember, this is rural America. Not one of us girls hadn't already fired a gun in our lives, and if any of the parents were uncomfortable about guns, they would never admit so in public. Things progressed little by little every time I went over. Within the next few visits, my friends and I were made to participate in a mini Bible study lesson. I guess one of the other girls had told their parents about the praying, because when we were dropped off, Mr. Cyrus said, "Oh, I forgot to mention, Eileen and I had a family Bible study planned for tonight. If you're uncomfortable with that, you can bring the girls back another night." This was the West in the 80s. Christianity was the default, and even people who didn't really practice felt obligated to pretend they did. No one in this town would have objected to their kids participating in a Bible study loud enough for anyone to hear. It didn't even matter, because the Bible study was also sort of fun. None of us complained about it, and we'd all seen how into it Ella seemed, and wouldn't have wanted to hurt her feelings by complaining. I think Mr. Cyrus took that as one of the final go-aheads needed. In late August, Mrs. Cyrus called my and my friend's parents and asked if we wanted to have a sleepover with Ella. Everyone agreed. The first red flag flew up right away. Most of us girls spent half our days off from school doing farm chores and helping around the house, so we were all in jeans. I had never seen Ella in pants ever, but what we wore had never been any sort of problem. When we got there this time, though, Ella had laid out 4 of her dresses on the bed and told us to change into them to look more like girls. We all liked playing dress-up, so we changed without complaint. But when we went downstairs, Mr. Cyrus said, "Look how ladylike you all are. Doesn't that feel better? You've made God very happy." At this point in a play date, we usually go out back and made mud pies or play tag or something. But instead, Mr. Cyrus jumped right into a Bible lesson. He was basically giving a sermon and talked about heaven and hell and the ways to get into heaven and be sent to hell. He scared our 7-year-old minds half to death about the fires of hell. Then he did what I can only describe as a cartoony attempt at hypnosis. And this was years ago, so it's a little fuzzy, but he dangled some piece of jewelry, like a necklace or something, right in front of us and swung it back and forth. While he did that, he recited Bible verses about telling the truth and repentance and the end times, clean souls entering the glory of heaven. And then he sat us all down on a couch. We were all thoroughly freaked out at this point by the heaven-hell talk, but figured everything else was just a religious ritual of their home, because he'd so carefully desensitized us over the past few months. He talked about sin and repentance, and asked us if we wanted to go to heaven or hell. I think you can guess which we said. He said the only way to get to heaven was to be baptized. One of my friends, Shirley, said she'd already been baptized, but Mr. Cyrus cut them off. Baptized into the real faith, God's faith. He asked if we wanted to know how we could become baptized, and we said yes. He said by confessing our sins and making them right with God, committing to living in a Christian-like way, and most importantly, accepting Jesus as our Savior. Sounded easy enough for us. For the next I don't know how long, there were no clocks in this house, and it was after dark by then. We basically did a very intense Bible study. It could have been anywhere between 10 minutes and 4 hours. When you're little and not accustomed to going to church, any amount of Bible study feels like an eternity. This was interspersed with different prayers for salvation and making promises about rejecting sin and resisting temptation. We were all getting very tired and feeling our patience wearing thin for tolerating others' religious beliefs. Then there was a whole barrage of prepper things. Different types of guns, talk about growing your own food, the importance of self-reliance, basically a lecture on survival skills, but with constant emphasis that the greatest survival skill is being a good Christian. He kept us up most of the night after that, praying and such. He did some ritual with rubbing oil on our foreheads as well. He vaguely talked on and off throughout the night about whether we'd want to go with Ella to a wonderful place with lots of other kids who love Christ. He said he'd ask our parents about taking us there on a weekend trip. I knew when I was agreeing with him that I had no interest, but my mom had taught me the polite thing to do when you get an invitation to something you have no intention of going to is to smile and express interest, then closer to the date say something came up. So I just smiled and expressed interest. He didn't feed us anything the entire time we were there. By the time it started to get light out, we were baptized in the backyard. Then we finally fell asleep, and a few hours later we were picked up. I told my mom I didn't want to go back because it was too religious for me. I told her we were up a lot of the night praying. I told my mom there was no food also, but since I'm such a picky eater, she was too used to hearing they had nothing to eat, when I really just meant something like they served meatloaf and would make me a grilled cheese instead. We stopped playing with Ella and just kind of put it behind us until high school, mentioning once every few years, remember that weird religious playdate? Since we didn't really understand any of the promises we'd made with Mr. Cyrus, we didn't pay half a mind to keeping them. We were exhausted and surrounded in daily life by Jesus rhetoric that everyone took seriously in the moment, then ignored once the preacher was out of earshot. In high school, it was heavily rumored that Ella's father, Mr. Cyrus, had Florence Hotef, famed for her involvement with the controversial Branch Davidians, visiting his home and leading some sort of prayer circle for him and people from his church. While I still don't know if she really came to visit him, it was all but irrefutably confirmed in high school that Mr. Cyrus belonged to an offshoot of Shepherd's Rod, the Christian apocalyptic extremist group rooted in Seventh-day Adventism. Nobody really talked to them much after that, in town even, because we all considered it a cult. I went out of state after high school, so I have no idea whatever happened with Ella's family, but Mr. Cyrus, let's not meet again.